My name is Zelda Whitmore. I am 68 years old, a retired accountant, and a widow who once believed that silence was simply a form of kindness. I gave my best years to my husband Richard and to our only son, Ethan. I built a home out of long nights and steady hands, never asking for more than a place at the table I helped set. People used to call me dependable. Now they call me old. After Richard died, the world grew very still. Grief has a way of making time sound hollow, like footsteps echoing in an empty church. I should have been left in peace to mourn the man I loved, but peace was not what my family had in mind. Richard left behind more than memories. He left behind a fortune, $28 million in pensions, investments, and careful savings we had guarded for half a lifetime. I hid it, as any careful accountant would, behind walls of paper and law. I thought I was protecting my family. Instead, I was protecting myself from them. You see, grief reveals people. It strips away politeness the way winter strips trees of leaves. Just 3 weeks after we buried Richard, my son and his wife Clara stood over me with papers in their hands. They pushed me, in my wheelchair, into a room that smelled of bleach and loneliness, a place they called a care home. They told me it was for my safety. They told me it was time to stop worrying. But I could see the lie sitting right there, black ink on thick white paper. At the top of the page were the words, "Comprehensive cognitive assessment and full medical power of attorney." My own son, the child I carried through sickness and storms, was asking me to sign away my life. He could not even look me in the eye. Clara pressed an expensive fountain pen into my hand. She smelled of sharp perfume and victory. The lawyer at her side wore a professional smile that looked like it had been practiced in a mirror. They thought they had me cornered, that I was a frail old woman with nothing left but fear. But silence can be louder than shouting. I placed the pen down with steady fingers. I folded my hands over my lap, where Richard's old embroidered handkerchief lay, the one with his initials stitched in fading blue thread. It was my anchor. It reminded me of who I was and of the dignity no paper could erase. I smiled, not the smile of surrender, but the quiet smile of someone holding a secret. They believed I was broken, that age and grief had dulled my mind. What they never knew was that the fortress was already built, every number balanced, every signature shielded. They had come to steal power, but in that very moment, they revealed their weakness. For when a son conspires against his mother, when a wife schemes against the family she married into, the world eventually takes notice. I sat in that sterile room and felt the weight of betrayal. Yet I also felt something else rising inside me, something sharper than anger and stronger than sorrow. It was resolve. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to beg. All I needed was patience, law, and the truth waiting quietly in my files. My name is Zelda Whitmore, and this is the story of how my son tried to declare me incompetent, how my daughter-in-law thought she could bury me in silence, and how I turned their betrayal into my strength. They pushed me toward a prison disguised as mercy, but I carried with me a secret they could never have imagined. The secret will that changed everything. And so the story begins. The morning of Richard's funeral was bitterly cold, even for late November in Minnesota. The church was filled with the heavy scent of lilies, a smell that clung to my hair and clothes long after the service ended. I remember sitting in the front pew, my hands folded over that same embroidered handkerchief Richard had given me when we were young. I thought the weight of grief would press me down into the wood. Yet what pressed even harder was the silence of those around me. A silence that was not reverence, but calculation. I had imagined that grief would draw people closer. I believed family would hold me up when I could no longer stand. Instead, I felt like a prop in a performance, the grieving widow who was expected to look fragile, expected to lean on others. Clara sat beside me, her gloved hand resting on my arm with a little too much force, as though she wanted people to notice her care. But the warmth was missing. Her touch was polished, rehearsed. Richard's coffin stood at the altar, draped in the flag of the labor union he had served for decades. He was a man of numbers, of principles, of steady choices. I had always thought the Union Hall would be where we both grew old, sipping weak coffee and listening to the next generation carry the torch. Instead, I was alone. My son Ethan shifted uncomfortably during the service, his eyes darting not toward the coffin, but toward Clara. When the pastor spoke of loyalty, Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line, as though the word itself carried weight he did not wish to bear. After the final hymn, people came to shake my hand. Old colleagues of Richard's spoke warmly, but their voices faded into a blur. I nodded politely, but my mind was elsewhere. I noticed Clara standing at the edge of the hall, whispering to a man in a sharp suit I did not recognize. Her smile was soft and social on the surface, yet her eyes gleamed with something far more precise. When she saw me watching, she stepped closer, wrapping her arm through Ethan's as if to shield him from my gaze. It was in that moment I realized grief would not be my only companion. Something darker had entered the room. My husband's body had not yet been laid in the ground, yet already the air was shifting around me. Later, as the pallbearers carried Richard out, the cold air rushed through the open doors and struck me like a blade. People shivered, drawing coats tighter, but I felt frozen in place. The world outside was white with snow, bright and blinding, while inside the church everything seemed dim, drained of color. Clara leaned in and whispered, "You should come stay with us for a while. It will be easier." Her words sounded tender, but her timing was cruel. I gave her no reply. Silence was my shield. Instead, I watched as Ethan placed his hand on Richard's coffin with trembling fingers, a son saying goodbye. Yet I could not ignore how quickly he turned back to Clara, how easily he let her guide him toward the waiting car. The drive home was long and hushed. Every house I passed looked warm, lit by small lamps in windows. Families gathered against the cold. But my own house, when I reached it, felt cavernous, stripped of its heart. I set Richard's handkerchief on the kitchen table and sat staring at it, feeling the weight of everything that had changed. That night, I understood something I had not wanted to admit. Grief was not the heaviest burden. The heaviest burden was suspicion, the realization that those closest to me might already be planning the next chapter of my life without me in it. 2 weeks after the funeral, my house was still heavy with the scent of lilies. I had opened every window, yet the air refused to change. Grief lingers in fabric, in wood, in silence. On a gray afternoon, Ethan arrived at my door. He did not knock the way he used to when he was a boy. He simply walked in, Clara a step behind him, as though the house no longer belonged to me at all. I brewed tea, the way I always did when family came. The kettle whistled softly, a sound that had once meant comfort. But as I placed the cups on the table, I saw Ethan's eyes scanning the room, not in nostalgia, but an appraisal. He looked at the framed photographs, at the furniture Richard and I had chosen, as though he were measuring what would remain and what would be sold. We sat in the kitchen. Clara crossed her legs neatly, her smile polished. Ethan cleared his throat, avoiding my gaze. "Mom," he began, his voice flat. "Clara and I have been talking. We think it's time for you to consider something easier." I let the words hang in the air, refusing to fill the silence for him. He shifted, then continued. "There's a new retirement community. It's modern, safe, with round-the-clock care. You wouldn't have to worry about cooking, cleaning, or being alone." Clara leaned forward, her hands folded gracefully. "It's really the best option, Zelda. You'd be with people your age, enjoying activities, surrounded by professionals who understand your needs. And, of course, Ethan and I would visit all the time." Her tone was sweet, but her eyes flickered, testing my reaction. I wrapped my fingers around the teacup, letting the heat steady me. Inside, my heart ached, not only for Richard but for the son who sat across from me, unable to see me as anything but a burden. This was the same boy who once clung to my hand on the first day of school, trembling until I whispered he was brave enough to walk alone. Now he could not look me in the eye while suggesting I surrender the life I had built. I said nothing. Silence has its own language. Clara filled the space quickly, as manipulators often do. "You see, Zelda, it's not about taking your independence. It's about making sure you're cared for properly. These homes are luxurious now. Think of it as a fresh start." Her words slipped into the air like oil, smooth and hard to grasp. But underneath, I heard the truth. It was not about care. It was about control. It was about access. Richard's fortune, our years of sacrifice and calculation, was the real conversation, though neither of them dared to speak it aloud. Ethan finally looked at me then, just for a second. His eyes carried shame, but not enough to stop him. "We'll take care of the details, Mom. You don't have to worry about anything." I placed my cup down carefully. My hands did not tremble. "I am not worried," I said softly. That was all. No explanations, no protests. My silence was heavier than any argument I could have made. The room chilled. Clara's smile faltered only for a breath before she recovered. Ethan nodded quickly, as if relieved that I had not shouted. They thought my quiet was consent. They mistook dignity for weakness. When they left, I remained at the table, the steam from the kettle long gone. The house was still mine, yet I felt the edges closing in. For the first time, I realized my son was not standing beside me in my grief. He was standing against me. When Ethan and Clara left that evening, their words still echoing like cold wind through the halls of my house, I found myself drifting back in time. Grief often does that. It pulls you into memories, searching for anchors, for proof that you were once more than what others see. I thought of my years as an accountant, the decades I spent balancing ledgers, checking and rechecking numbers until every column stood unshakable. I was never just a wife or a mother, though I gave myself fully to both roles. I was a woman of numbers. At the Union Hall, I was known as the quiet one in the corner office, the one who never raised her voice, but whose presence carried weight. Men twice my size would lower their tone when they stepped into my office, because they knew I had the records that could hold them accountable. I remember the long nights in that office, the sound of pencils scratching, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. I built walls of accuracy, fortresses of documentation, Every figure had to match, every cent accounted for. If one number wavered, I stayed until I found the error. There was pride in that work, not because it made me important, but because it kept families safe. Paychecks were not just paper. They were food on the table, coats for children, dignity for workers who gave their strength to the factories. Richard used to tease me about my meticulous ways. "Zell," he would say with that half-smile of his, "you could hide gold in those files and no one would ever find it." I would laugh, but there was truth in his words. Numbers were my armor. They did not bend for charm or pressure. They told the truth when people lied. Those habits never left me. Even after retirement, I kept my records tidy. Bank statements in labeled folders, investments tracked monthly, pensions safeguarded with cross-checked signatures. I knew the law, not in grand speeches, but in the fine print most people ignored. To others, it might have seemed tedious, but to me, it was strength. It was clarity. As I sat at my kitchen table that night, I realized this foundation, this steel beneath my silence, was what would carry me forward. Clara could smile her polished smile. Ethan could speak of easier living. But they had forgotten who I was. They remembered only the mother who baked pies and sewed buttons, not the accountant who had once stared down auditors and union bosses without blinking. I thought of one winter long ago when the company tried to cut pensions quietly. I had caught the numbers buried in a report, hidden like dust under a rug. I remember standing before a room full of men in suits, my voice calm but unwavering, pointing out each line, each contradiction. By the end, they had no choice but to reverse their decision. The workers never knew my name, but they kept their security. That was enough. Now, staring at the shadows stretching across my living room, I whispered to myself, "You are not weak. You are built from steel." The words were not loud, but they were steady. I folded Richard's handkerchief carefully, laying it across the folder of documents I had retrieved earlier. The fabric was soft from years of use, but the stitches were firm, just as I had been. The world might see me as an aging widow, fragile and alone. But I knew better. I had built fortresses before, and I could build them again. If my son and his wife wanted to test my resolve, they would soon learn that beneath the silence they mistook for surrender lay the unshakable foundation of a woman forged by years of numbers, law, and truth. The morning after Ethan's visit, I woke to the sound of snowplows scraping the street outside. Winter had arrived early, and with it came a silence so heavy it pressed against the windows. I made coffee, black and strong, the way Richard had always liked it. As the steam rose, curling like memory itself, I heard a knock at the door. It was Grace O'Connor. Grace and I had known each other for nearly 40 years. We met when our husbands worked side by side at the Union Hall. Where I was quiet, Grace was bold. Where I hesitated, she spoke her mind. Yet beneath her candor was a heart as steady as bedrock. She was the kind of friend who appeared not when it was convenient, but when it was necessary. She brushed the snow from her coat as she stepped inside, shaking the cold from her gloves. "I thought you could use some company," she said simply. No pity in her voice, just presence. That was her gift. She sat at the kitchen table, her sharp eyes scanning my face. "You look thinner," she remarked, but it wasn't criticism. It was concern wrapped in honesty. I poured her a cup and settled across from her. For a moment, we simply sipped in silence. Then she leaned forward. "Zell, I've known you too long to pretend. I saw Ethan at the service. I saw Clara, too. Something's not right. Her words cut through the fog in my chest. I wanted to deny it, to protect my son even from judgment, but my silence spoke louder. Grace reached across the table and touched my hand. You've always carried more than your share, but don't let them mistake your kindness for weakness. Her words stirred something in me. I remembered the times she had stood by me, when Richard lost his job for 6 months, when Ethan broke his leg as a boy, when the bills piled high. Grace had been there with casseroles, with laughter, with the kind of stubborn loyalty that only true friends give. Now she was here again, reminding me of myself. You think I don't see it? She continued. But I do. Clara has a hunger in her eyes, and Ethan, well, he follows where she leads. You have to be careful. I breathed in slowly, feeling the truth settle. I did not need Grace to tell me what I already knew, yet hearing it aloud gave it shape. I nodded. I won't let them take what Richard and I built, I said quietly. It was the first time I had spoken the thought out loud, and it startled me with its certainty. Grace smiled then, not with joy, but with respect. That's the Zell I know, stronger than steel, even when you whisper. We talked a while longer, about small things. The weather, the old Union picnics, the grandchildren she adored. But beneath every word was the unspoken truth. She was standing with me. Even if the world shifted, even if my own son turned away, I was not entirely alone. When she finally left, the house did not feel quite as empty. I stood at the window watching her footprints trail across the snow, clear and certain against the white. I thought of the handkerchief folded in my pocket, Richard's initials still stitched there, and of Grace's hand on mine. One was memory, the other was presence. Together they anchored me. That night, as I prepared for bed, I whispered to myself, "Silence is not surrender." The words felt like a promise. Grace had reminded me of who I was and who I still could be. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Clara returned, this time not alone. Beside her stood a man in a gray suit, his briefcase polished, his smile sharp. She introduced him as Mark Evans, an attorney who specialized in elder care. The words tasted sour before they even left her lips. We sat in the living room, the three of us arranged like actors in a scene I had not agreed to play. Clara spoke quickly, her voice coated in sweetness. "Zelda, we just want to make sure everything is in place for your safety. These papers will help. It's standard, really. Just medical authorization, financial support, nothing to worry about." Mark placed the folder on the coffee table with deliberate precision. He pulled out a pen, sleek, black, gold-tipped. The cap snapped off with a sound that cut the room in half. Click. That single note echoed louder than Clara's rehearsed words. My stomach tightened. That sound was not care. It was the opening of a trap. Clara slid the first page toward me, her manicured finger pointing neatly at the line awaiting my signature. "This way, Ethan and I can take care of everything for you. You won't have to stress over bills or medical appointments. We'll shoulder the responsibility." Her eyes gleamed. She believed she was offering kindness. In truth, she was offering chains. I lifted the pen slowly, feeling its weight in my hand. Years of accounting had made me respect the power of ink. A signature is not just a mark. It is surrender or protection, prison or freedom. My pulse beat steady in my ears. I glanced at Richard's handkerchief folded on the arm of the chair. His initials stared back at me, firm, unyielding. I set the pen down. "I'll need time," I said softly. Clara's smile flickered. Time? Zelda, this is routine. There's no need to drag it out. Mark cleared his throat. Of course, Mrs. Whitmore. But the sooner it's signed, the sooner you can rest easy. His tone was velvet wrapped around steel. I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. Rest comes when I choose it, I replied. The silence after my words grew thick. Clara's jaw tightened, though her lips curved upward again. For a long moment, no one moved. The pen sat on the table, gleaming under the lamp like a loaded weapon. Clara finally broke the stillness, her voice sharper now. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I did not answer. I had learned long ago that silence unsettles the guilty more than anger ever could. Clara shifted in her seat, tapping her nails against the folder. Mark closed the file with a quick motion, the papers snapping together like a verdict. They left shortly after, Clara's heels striking the floor with clipped finality. At the door, she turned and said, "We only want what's best for you." Her eyes betrayed her words. They were not filled with care, but calculation. When the house was quiet again, I returned to my chair. I picked up the pen they had left behind, running my fingers over the smooth barrel. A tool so small, yet powerful enough to decide the rest of my life. I placed it back on the folder and covered both with Richard's handkerchief, the stitches firm under my palm. In that moment, I knew this was only the beginning. They believed I was hesitant, uncertain. What they did not understand was that I was building my own defense, stone by stone, in silence. A fortress hidden in plain sight. When the door closed behind Clara and her lawyer, the silence of the house pressed in on me like snow piling against the windows. Their voices still lingered, their polished words echoing through the rooms Richard and I had built with our own hands. I sat for a long while, staring at the folder and the pen they had left behind, the trap neatly packaged as care. As dusk settled, I rose and walked to the study. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, the scent of Richard's years as a union man. Against the far wall stood the heavy safe we had kept since the 70s. Its paint was chipped, its edges worn, but it had never failed us. Richard used to joke that it held more than money. It held our life. I knelt before it, pressing my palm against the cold steel. My fingers traced the dial, familiar even after all these years. Each click of the wheel carried memory. The first time we bought the safe, Richard had said, "Zell, if the world ever turns against us, this will be our fortress." Back then, I had laughed, not realizing how prophetic his words would feel decades later. The door swung open with a groan, revealing neatly stacked folders, deeds, pension documents, and investment statements. On top lay a small wooden box. I lifted it carefully, my hands trembling, not with weakness, but with the weight of memory. Inside was Richard's handkerchief, the one with his initials stitched in faded blue thread. I pressed it to my face, breathing in the faint trace of him that still clung to the fabric. The handkerchief had always been with him, tucked in his pocket at union meetings, folded neatly beside his Bible on Sundays. To others, it was just cloth. To me, it was the anchor of a man who had given his life to work and family. Now it was mine to carry, a reminder that even in silence, I was not alone. I set the handkerchief on the stack of documents and began to sort. Deeds, wills, pension accounts, every line carefully signed and safeguarded. Years of meticulous accounting had left me with an arsenal stronger than Clara or Ethan could imagine. They thought of me as fragile, but here in the quiet of my study, I felt the steel of my own history. I whispered into the dim room, "You cannot take what was built in honesty." The words were not for Clara, not even for Ethan. They were for Richard, for myself, for the life we had forged together. Carefully, I gathered the most critical papers into a folder and slid them into my desk drawer. Then I placed the handkerchief on top, smoothing its worn edges. That fabric, delicate yet enduring, would remind me every time I opened the drawer that strength is not in shouting, but in holding steady. As the night deepened, I sat at the desk with the lamp casting a small circle of light. I thought of Clara's eyes, sharp with hunger, and Ethan's silence, heavy with complicity. They believed they had time, that I would falter. But time was my ally. I had built fortresses out of numbers before. I could build them again, in silence, in patience, in law. I closed the safe, spinning the dial until the lock clicked home. The sound was final, like a door shutting on the illusion of weakness. I carried the folder back to the kitchen and placed it neatly beside my teacup. Then, with Richard's handkerchief folded carefully on top, I whispered, "If they want war, they will find I fight with silence." The day came without warning. Ethan called in the morning, his voice brisk, telling me to pack a small bag. He said it was just a visit, just to see the place. Clara arrived with him, smiling too brightly, as if this were a family outing instead of an exile. I folded Richard's handkerchief into my coat pocket before I stepped out the door. Something told me I would need it. The drive was quiet. Snow clung to the edges of the road, gray with salt and exhaust. Ethan kept his eyes on the wheel, and Clara filled the silence with chatter about amenities, activities, and safety. I stared out the window at the bare trees, their branches stripped like bones. I thought of how easily life is pruned when others decide it is no longer useful. When we arrived, the building loomed gray against the sky. Its windows were uniform, its lawn too neatly trimmed, like a place designed for order rather than life. Inside, the air was thick with the sharp scent of bleach. It stung my nose, clung to my clothes. A nurse greeted us with a practiced smile, leading us down a hallway where the floor gleamed unnaturally, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. The room they showed me was small, neat, and sterile. A single bed pressed against the wall, white sheets tucked so tightly they could have belonged to a hospital. A dresser, a chair, a small television mounted high in the corner. No warmth, no history, just function. The kind of room where a person's past is erased and their future is scheduled by others. Clara clasped her hands together. "Isn't it lovely, Zelda? Fresh paint, safe environment, everything you could need." I sat on the edge of the bed. The mattress was stiff. The sheets smelled of detergent and nothing else. I imagined Richard's voice here, the echo of our laughter, the stories we had shared. But the walls held no memory. They swallowed sound whole. Ethan stood near the door, avoiding my eyes. "It's only a trial, Mom. Just to see if you like it." His voice was thin, unsure. I wondered if he heard himself, if he realized the cruelty in presenting abandonment as kindness. The nurse pointed out the schedule on the wall: meals at fixed times, group activities, medication rounds. I thought of my kitchen table, of my freedom to brew coffee at midnight if I wished, to sit in silence as long as I pleased. Here, silence was not mine. It belonged to the routine. I pulled the handkerchief from my pocket and held it in my lap. The faded stitches grounded me, reminding me that I was more than this room, more than their plans. My life had been full of work, sacrifice, and love. I was not an item to be stored neatly away. Clara walked to the window, pulling back the blinds. The view was of the parking lot, cars lined up like soldiers. "It's practical," she said, her tone smug. "So much easier for everyone." Her words pierced me. Easier for whom? Certainly not for me. But I said nothing. Silence wrapped around me, heavier than the bleach in the air. After a few minutes, Ethan announced it was time to go. I rose from the bed, slowly, pressing the handkerchief to my palm. As we walked back through the corridor, I passed other residents, some staring blankly, others shuffling slowly with walkers. I saw in them reflections of what Clara wished me to become: quiet, managed, diminished. But inside me, something hardened. This room, with its bleach and its sterile walls, had shown me the truth. They were not here to help me live. They were here to watch me fade. When we returned from that dreadful visit, Clara seemed almost triumphant. She carried herself with the glow of someone who believed victory was near. Ethan looked relieved, as though a burden had been lifted from his shoulders. Neither of them spoke much on the drive back, and I kept my eyes on the road ahead, watching the bare trees blur into shadows. At home, I let them believe I was exhausted. I sank into the armchair, letting my shoulders sag, my breath come shallow. Clara hovered, her voice coated in concern. "You see, Zelda, it wasn't so bad. Imagine how nice it would be not to worry anymore." She touched my arm, light as frost. I gave her a faint nod, nothing more. Ethan crouched beside me, his eyes searching mine. "Mom, we're just trying to help. You've been through so much. You shouldn't have to manage alone." His words were careful, almost rehearsed. I wondered if he convinced himself before he tried to convince me. I pressed Richard's handkerchief to my lips, pretending to wipe away fatigue. Inside, my mind was sharp, alive with calculation. Let them think I was frail. Let them think I was ready to surrender. There is power in being underestimated. That evening, I moved slower than usual, dragging my feet slightly on the wooden floor. Clara noticed, and I caught the flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. To her, I was drifting closer to the outcome she desired. To me, I was weaving a curtain of illusion. I recalled my years in accounting, when auditors would attempt to catch me off guard with clever phrasing. I had learned then that silence unsettled them more than denial. A pause could make them doubt their own certainty. Now, I used that same strategy. My silence was not absence. It was a weapon. The next few days, I allowed Clara to fuss over me. She brought groceries, rearranged my kitchen, clucked her tongue at the dust she claimed gathered too quickly. I let her speak, let her instruct, let her imagine she was guiding me. All the while, I observed. I watched how she touched Ethan's arm when she wanted his compliance. I noticed how his shoulders drooped whenever she spoke of responsibility. One evening, Clara whispered to Ethan in the hallway, thinking I could not hear. "She's slipping. It won't be long before the papers are ready." Her voice was honey and venom at once. Ethan murmured something indistinct, and the sound of it broke my heart. My son was no longer my ally. He was her shadow. I sat quietly in the living room, the handkerchief resting in my lap. I traced the faded initials, feeling the strength of memory flow through me. Richard had once said, "Zell, you don't need to shout to be heard. Just wait. The truth always reveals itself." His words echoed in me now, steady as a heartbeat. So I waited, I smiled faintly when Clara spoke of next steps. I allowed Ethan to believe his mother was too tired to resist. But inside, I was taking note of every detail, every slip of the tongue, every look exchanged between them. The art of survival is not in constant battle. It is in patience. Wolves reveal themselves when they think the lamb has lain down. I was no lamb. I was steel wrapped in silence, waiting for the right moment to rise. That night, as I lay in bed, the moonlight spilling through the curtains, I whispered into the darkness, "Let them think I am broken. When the time comes, they will learn how wrong they were." It was Grace who suggested I speak to someone I could trust outside the family. Her words stayed with me, circling in my mind like a bell that would not stop ringing. So, one morning, I called Samuel Price. He had been Richard's colleague years ago, a lawyer who had earned my husband's respect by fighting quietly but fiercely for workers' rights. If Richard trusted him, I knew I could as well. We met in his office downtown, a place filled with shelves of books that smelled of dust and time. Samuel was older now, hair silver at the temples, but his eyes were sharp. He listened without interruption as I laid out what Ethan and Clara had been pressing me to do. When I finished, he leaned back, fingers steepled, and said, "Zelda, you need protection, not against strangers, but against your own." The words stung because they were true. I nodded, folding Richard's handkerchief in my lap. Samuel outlined a plan. 3 layers, like a fortress built not of stone, but of law. The first layer was a living trust. By transferring assets into it, I could dictate exactly how and when they would be used, bypassing probate and shielding them from hands too eager. The second was what he called a no-contest clause. If Ethan or Clara tried to challenge the trust, they would forfeit everything. It was a safeguard against betrayal dressed as entitlement. The third layer was Samuel himself, appointed as trustee. He would be my watchman, ensuring no paper could be signed under duress. No manipulation could go unchecked. As he spoke, I felt the weight in my chest ease slightly. Yet another weight settled. The moral one. Could I really cut my own son out of inheritance if he pushed too far? Could a mother turn her back on blood? Samuel seemed to read my thoughts. "You're not turning your back, Zelda. You're drawing boundaries. There is a difference. Love does not mean surrender." I thought of Ethan as a boy, how he once brought me dandelions in his small fists, proud of the weeds he thought were flowers. I thought of how he used to fall asleep on Richard's chest, secure and unafraid. That boy was gone, replaced by a man who could not see me beyond my age, beyond the numbers he wanted to control. I whispered, "A mother is supposed to give everything." Samuel's reply was steady. "And a son is supposed to protect, not prey. You are not failing him. He is failing you. The law is here to remind him of that." The silence in the room was heavy, but not hopeless. I signed the first papers, my hand steady. Each stroke of the pen was not surrender, but resistance. Clara's sleek pen had been a weapon meant to bind me. This pen was my shield, my declaration that I would not be erased. Walking out of that office, I breathed the winter air deeply. The city hummed around me, cars rushing, people moving with purpose. I felt a small piece of that purpose return to me. Clara thought she had me cornered. Ethan thought I was fading. But now I had walls higher than they could climb. That night, as I locked the safe again, I placed the new documents beneath Richard's handkerchief. I whispered into the silence, "If blood turns against me, the law will stand with me." I wondered if the world would judge me harshly, if people would say a mother should never cut her child out. Yet I also knew others would understand, those who had been used, manipulated, or abandoned. Sometimes love means letting go of what destroys you. Sometimes silence must be signed in ink. Clara's hands were the kind of hands people trusted at first glance. Slim, manicured, polished with a pale shade of pink that gave the impression of care and refinement. But I had come to know them differently. They were not hands of comfort. They were hands that closed doors, pressed pens into my grip, and steered my wheelchair as though I were cargo. I still remember the first time I noticed it clearly. After Richard's funeral, when guests were leaving in clusters of black coats, Clara came to my side. She placed her hand over mine, squeezing gently. To others, it looked tender, the act of a dutiful daughter-in-law. But the pressure was just a little too firm, just a little too lingering. It was not affection. It was possession. Weeks later, in the Maple Rest facility, I felt her hands again, one resting lightly on my shoulder, the other sliding the fountain pen across the table toward me. She said softly, "Just a formality, Zelda." Her voice dripped honey, but her hand pressed down, steadying the papers so I would not think of pushing them away. I did not resist then, though every nerve inside me screamed to. Her hands were always busy, offering tea, adjusting my scarf, patting my arm when Ethan fumbled with excuses. But each gesture carried weight. She was mapping boundaries, reminding me that she could step into my space whenever she chose. There was strategy in her touch. She knew appearances mattered. An outsider watching us would have sworn she adored me. What they did not see was the tightening of her fingers when I hesitated, or the subtle way she blocked the armrest when I shifted, a silent reminder that movement depended on her permission. I had raised children. I knew what gentle hands looked like. Clara's were not gentle. They were rehearsed. One evening, I sat with her in the living room. Ethan had gone to take a call, leaving the two of us in silence. She poured tea into delicate china cups, her movements elegant. Then she passed me mine, her hand brushing against mine deliberately. "You know, Zelda," she murmured, "it would give everyone such peace if you let us help more." I looked at the steam rising from the cup, at her fingers steady on the handle. That was when it struck me. Clara believed her hands told the story, that of a caregiver, a protector. But what they truly revealed was her hunger for control. She mistook my silence for surrender, not knowing that silence can be the sharpest refusal. I thought back to Richard's hands, strong, calloused from years at the mill, gentle when they held mine. His touch never forced, never calculated. That memory was my anchor. Whenever Clara tried to steer me, I reminded myself of the difference between love and leverage. Clara underestimated me because of my stillness. She mistook age for weakness, quiet for compliance. She did not understand that I was watching, storing every moment, every misplaced squeeze, every feigned pat. That night, when she finally left, I went upstairs alone. I sat at my desk and opened the drawer where Samuel's documents lay folded beneath Richard's handkerchief. I touched the fabric, then the papers, and whispered to myself, "Her hands will not write my story. Mine will." I knew what was coming. Clara would press harder. Ethan would follow her lead, and they would believe I had no strength left to resist. Let them. A fortress does not shout its strength, It stands unmoved until the storm breaks against it. The next time Clara's hand closed over mine, I did not flinch. I let her think she held me in place. But in my heart, I had already shifted the ground beneath her feet. There are truths people carry to their graves. Truths too heavy, too complicated, or too dangerous to set free while the world still watches. For years, I believed Richard left this earth with all of his secrets intact. But the night I opened the small wooden box he had hidden in the attic, I realized he had left one for me to find. It was a plain box, no lock, no ornament, just cedar worn smooth by time. Inside lay an envelope with my name written in his steady hand. My fingers shook as I unfolded the letter. Richard had written it months before he died, perhaps sensing what would come. He told me of a man named Frank Delaney, one of the workers at the mill in the late 70s. Frank's wife had fallen ill, and the insurance they had was pitiful. Richard wrote about watching Frank come to work hollow-eyed, desperate, trying to borrow money from anyone who would listen. Then the day came when Frank confessed he was about to lose his house. The bank was circling like a vulture, and there was nothing left for him to sell. Richard had discretionary authority over part of the union fund, meant for long-term projects. He admitted in the letter that he moved money from that fund to cover Frank's debt. $150,000. It was not legal. It was not recorded properly. But it kept a roof over a dying woman's head and gave Frank time to hold her hand until the very end. Richard confessed he had intended to pay it back himself over the years, to replace what he had taken. But life and illness cut that plan short. He begged me not to see it as theft, but as a debt of honor, his attempt to keep faith with the men who worked beside him. Reading those words, I felt my chest tighten. The world, if it ever discovered this, would call it fraud. Clara, with her sharp eyes and her hunger for leverage, would call it corruption. But I knew better. I knew Richard. He was not a thief. He was a man who carried the weight of other people's pain until it broke him. I sat in that attic, the dust floating like ghosts in the light of a single bulb, and whispered, "You carried it alone, Richard. Now it's mine to carry." That was the truth no one knew. Not Ethan, not Clara, not even Grace. I folded the letter carefully and placed it beneath the handkerchief in the safe. It was not just paper. It was a reminder of the line between law and justice, between what is written in statutes and what is written in the heart. For days, I wrestled with it. Should I destroy the letter, protect his memory, erase the risk? Or should I keep it, a testament to the man he really was? I chose to keep it. Because even in his imperfection, Richard taught me something greater, that honor does not live in spotless records or flawless reputations. It lives in choices, often costly, often unseen. No one else knows this story. To them, the fortune is just numbers in an account, a mountain of dollars waiting to be fought over. To me, it is layered with sacrifice. Each dollar carries a name, a story, a scar, and I will not let Clara strip it down to greed. As I closed the box, I felt the air shift. Secrets, once revealed, change the ground beneath your feet. My fortress was stronger now, not because it was flawless, but because it was real. The truth, unspoken for decades, now lived in me. And I would guard it, silently but fiercely, until the end. The house was still that night, as if it too had grown weary of carrying secrets. I had gone to bed early, wrapping myself in the quilt Richard's mother had sewn decades ago. Sleep would not come. My mind replayed Richard's letter again and again. the debt of honor, the burden left behind. I closed my eyes, but the silence pressed too hard. That was when I heard it. A faint murmur drifting up the staircase. Ethan's voice. Low, hurried, almost trembling. I slipped from bed, feet finding the old path across the wooden floor, careful to avoid the boards that groaned. At the landing, I froze, listening. "I know it looks bad," he was saying, his voice cracking like a boy caught lying. A pause, then softer. "But Clara promised. Once it's under my control, we'll pay you back. Every cent." I leaned against the wall, breath caught in my throat. His control. My fortune. He was bargaining with something that was not his to give. The other voice was muffled through the phone, but firm. A man, terse and impatient. I caught fragments, deadlines, interest, consequences. A name flickered through the static. Pike. It struck me like a match in the dark. Ethan's reply came fast, desperate. "Just give me until the papers are signed. She said she can make it happen. Clara always finds a way." My heart clenched. Clara was not just leading him. She was gambling with him. My son, so hungry for validation, had become her pawn. His voice faltered. "You don't understand. This is my chance. If I can deliver, I'm not just a failure anymore." There it was, the truth beneath his betrayal. Not greed alone, but shame. A man chasing the shadow of worth he never believed he had. I should have gone back to bed. I should have pretended not to hear. But I stayed, my hand pressed to the cold wood of the banister, listening to my child dig himself deeper. When he ended the call, I heard the weight in his sigh, the rustle of his hands dragging down his face. For a moment, I imagined walking down the stairs, placing my hand on his shoulder, telling him he was still my son. But the words would not come. Compassion and disappointment warred inside me until silence won. I returned to my room and sat on the edge of the bed. The quilt lay across my lap, its stitches uneven in places where Richard's mother's hands had trembled with age. Each flaw was love, every thread a gift. That quilt was safety. But what I had just heard was danger coiled tight. "Pike," I whispered the name aloud, testing the sound. It meant nothing to me then, yet I knew it mattered. My treasurer's instincts never failed me. Names are numbers, and numbers always find their place. Sleep did not come. Instead, I stared at the ceiling, replaying Ethan's words. "Once it's under my control." That was Clara's promise, not his. She was scripting his lines, pulling his strings, and he was too lost in desperation to see it. By morning, I had made my decision. If my son's hands were tied to hers, then I would not reach for him. I would cut the strings instead. Quietly, without warning, as one trims away a diseased branch to save the tree. No one knew of that call but me, and I carried it like a stone in my pocket. Silent, heavy, undeniable. A mother's love had not vanished, but it had changed. It had sharpened into resolve. That night, I understood something I had never admitted before. Ethan was not just my child anymore. He was also a man who could hurt me, and I would not let him. Clara chose the restaurant. Of course she did. It was the sort of place where the waiters wore gloves and the menu had no prices, because anyone who had to ask didn't belong there. The lights were dim, golden, designed to flatter faces and hide flaws. Around us, the air hummed with the laughter of people who believed they were safe. Ethan and I sat side by side, Clara across from us. The tablecloth was the kind of white so sharp it almost glowed. A candle flickered between us, its flame unsteady in the faint draft. I noticed the way Clara's hands rested on the table, poised, fingers barely tapping. She was rehearsing her next move. For 20 minutes, she played the game of small talk, weather, investments, a new gallery opening she had attended. Ethan nodded, chimed in when prompted, his eyes never meeting mine. He looked smaller than I remembered, as though shame had carved inches off him. Then Clara leaned forward, her voice lowering as though she were offering me a secret. "Zelda," she began, "we've been thinking about the future, about legacy." I said nothing, only sipped the water the waiter had poured. She continued, "Your financial health is remarkable, thanks to Richard's foresight. But it's time to consolidate, to be proactive. We've spoken with a service that manages everything: medical appointments, property, long-term care. They'd be your personal CEO. It's seamless, efficient." I let her words hang in the air, waiting for Ethan to speak. When he finally did, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Mom, it's just paperwork, temporary, just so I can help." He slid a folded document across the table, the paper whispering against the cloth. I looked down at it. The title was a dagger in ink: Medical Power of Attorney. Silence stretched. I placed my hand over the paper, not in acceptance, but in stillness. Clara's eyes gleamed. She thought I was considering. The waiter arrived with the wine, a deep red, poured into crystal glasses. Clara raised hers delicately. "To family," she said, her smile practiced. Ethan lifted his glass slowly, following her lead. I kept my hands on the table. When the waiter reached for my glass, I shifted, just slightly. The wine spilled, first a drop, then a ribbon, then a bloom across the blinding white cloth. It spread quickly, dark red against white, like blood soaking into bandages. Ethan flinched. Clara's smile froze. I studied the stain, the way it reached outward, unstoppable. "That's what happens," I said softly, "when something pure is touched by unsteady hands." Neither of them spoke. The restaurant's murmur went on around us, but at our table, the silence was louder than any violin playing in the background. Clara recovered first. She reached across, her hand brushing mine, too sweet, too insistent. "Zelda, don't make this harder than it needs to be. We're trying to help." I met her eyes, steady. "Help is never forced, Clara. Help is offered, not signed." Her fingers tightened, but I didn't pull away. I let her feel the strength under my stillness, the refusal in my silence. Finally, I folded the paper, slid it back across the table. My voice was calm, each word sharp as glass. "I will not be signing anything, not today, not ever." Ethan's face crumpled, torn between loyalty to me and the strings Clara had tied around him. Clara's hand withdrew slowly, her nails tapping against her glass. The stain on the cloth remained, a dark, spreading truth no one could wipe away. That night, as I walked out into the cold air, I carried the image with me. Blood on white, betrayal laid bare, and a reminder that silence can cut deeper than any shouted refusal. They thought the wine stain would be forgotten once the table was cleared. But it followed us home, invisible yet present, clinging to the silence in Ethan's car. Clara sat in the back beside me, Ethan driving with tense shoulders, both of them pretending the night had not fractured. When we reached my house, they did not leave. Instead, Clara asked calmly, "May we come in? Just for a moment, Zelda." Her voice was velvet, wrapped around steel. I opened the door, knowing what awaited me. In the living room, Clara set her phone on the coffee table, angled toward me. A man's face appeared on the glowing screen. Mark, their lawyer. His voice was smooth, confident. Mrs. Whitmore, I've reviewed everything. There's nothing to fear. Signing this power of attorney would only simplify your life. Ethan added quickly, Mom, he's right. It's only paperwork. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the papers once more, laying them in front of me like an offering. I sat in my armchair, my quilt draped across my knees, Richard's handkerchief folded beneath my fingers. My heart pounded, but my face betrayed nothing. Mark spoke again, this time firmer. If you refuse, Clara and Ethan may have no choice but to petition for conservatorship. A judge could assign them decision-making authority regardless. The words should have frightened me. Perhaps they did. But fear no longer had a place to live inside me. I lifted my gaze from the papers to Clara's eyes. She was smiling, not kindly, but with the satisfaction of someone who believed the trap had sprung. And so I smiled back. It was not wide, not mocking, just a small, steady curve of the lips, quiet, but deliberate. Clara blinked, her smile faltering as though she could not understand what I found amusing. Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Mom, why are you smiling? I didn't answer. My silence stretched, wrapping itself around the room like a shroud. The longer it lingered, the heavier it became. Mark cleared his throat over the phone. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to advise you. I leaned forward, folded the papers neatly, and set them aside. Then I returned my hands to the quilt, still smiling. My eyes never left Clara's. She shifted in her seat. You think this is a game? She asked softly, her composure cracking. I finally spoke, my voice low, measured. No, Clara. I think you mistake my silence for weakness. That is your error, not mine. The room held its breath. Ethan looked from me to her, confusion written across his face. He had expected pleading, perhaps anger. Instead, I gave him stillness. Clara's fingers tapped against her knee, a rhythm too fast, too sharp. She tried again. Zelda, this can end easily. Sign tonight and everything will be peaceful. I tilted my head, smile unbroken. Peace is not forced with ink. For the first time since Richard's death, I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was real. Mark began speaking again, rattling off statutes and procedures, but his words faded into the background. My silence had done more than his threats ever could. Finally, I rose from my chair, the quilt slipping slightly from my knees. I placed Richard's handkerchief gently on the folded papers. You can leave these here, I said evenly, but they will remain unsigned. I turned toward the staircase, each step deliberate, my back straight. Behind me, I heard Clara's whisper, sharp and disbelieving. She smiled. Why did she smile? In my room, alone again, I closed the door and exhaled. The smile lingered, not from triumph, but from clarity. Sometimes the loudest refusal is the quietest gesture. And tonight, silence was my weapon. Courthouses are never warm. Even in the summer, their walls breathe cold air, as if justice must always be delivered from a distance. The morning of the hearing, I walked through the double doors with my head high, my quilt folded carefully in my arms. People might have thought it odd, but for me it was armor. Clara and Ethan were already seated inside. Clara wore a navy suit, crisp and sharp, her hair pulled back in a bun that announced control. Ethan looked pale, his tie crooked, sweat already blooming along his collar. I almost reached to straighten it in memory of gentler days, but stopped myself. Those days were gone. Their attorney, Mark, shuffled papers confidently, nodding to them as though the verdict were already certain. Across the aisle, my own lawyer, Mrs. Harding, a woman in her 70s with steel gray hair and eyes that missed nothing, sat waiting. Clara underestimated me in believing I would come alone. The judge entered. The room rose, then settled into silence heavy as stone. Mark began first, his voice polished. Your Honor, this is a petition for conservatorship. The respondents, Ethan and Clara Whitmore, are simply acting out of love and duty. Mrs. Whitmore, his hand gestured toward me, is a widow of 72, recently bereaved, and by all accounts struggling. We present medical affidavits suggesting cognitive decline, confusion, and vulnerability to exploitation. The words struck like darts, but I did not flinch. Instead, I smoothed the quilt across my lap, letting silence answer. Mrs. Harding rose, steady as a mountain. Your Honor, we reject this petition. My client is not incompetent. She is deliberate, capable, and prepared to demonstrate as much. The affidavits provided are outdated, based on assumptions rather than medical truth. The judge's gaze shifted toward me. Mrs. Whitmore, do you understand the nature of these proceedings? I nodded. My voice, calm and even, filled the room. Yes, Your Honor. My son and his wife believe I am incapable of managing my life. I disagree. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Mark called Ethan to the stand. My son stumbled through rehearsed lines. My forgetfulness, moments of silence, the wine spilled at dinner. He twisted them into evidence. Clara's eyes never left me, cold and triumphant. Then came my turn. Mrs. Harding handed me a folder. My hands did not shake as I opened it. Inside were neatly tabbed documents, current bank statements, property titles, letters I had written in flawless clarity, and a statement from my physician confirming my sound mind. Each page was stamped with recent dates. I spoke softly, but every word carried. Your Honor, I manage accounts exceeding $28 million. I file my taxes, maintain my household, and make decisions daily. Silence does not mean confusion. Stillness is not incompetence. The judge leaned forward, studying me. Clara shifted uncomfortably. Ethan looked down at his hands. Finally, Mrs. Harding presented the last piece, a notarized record of my recent charitable donations, carefully executed in my name. Proof not only of clarity, but of intent. The silence that followed was different this time. It was not the silence of doubt, but the silence of recognition. When the gavel struck to adjourn until the following week, Clara's smile was gone. Ethan avoided my eyes entirely. I gathered my quilt, stood, and walked out of the courtroom without looking back. Outside, the sun was bright, almost blinding. For the first time in weeks, I felt warmth spread across my face. The battle was far from over, but the fortress had held its ground. When the hearing resumed, Clara's confidence filled the room before she even spoke. She had something new, something sharpened. I could see it in the way she arranged her papers, the way her lips curved, in anticipation. Mark rose and addressed the judge. Your Honor, beyond the affidavits, we now submit recorded evidence, direct proof of Mrs. Whitmore's cognitive decline. My stomach tightened, though my face remained still. From a small device, Ethan pressed play. At first, I heard nothing but static. Then came my own voice, thin, faltering. I don't know what day it is. I can't remember. Everything is gone. The sound cut through me like a blade. That was my voice, but not my truth. The recording was fractured, chopped, pieces torn from context. I recognized the night. It was weeks after Richard's funeral, when I had wept into the phone to Grace, my words broken by grief, Clara had twisted mourning into madness. Clara's eyes flicked toward me, triumphant. She thought she had won. The judge listened carefully, brows furrowed. Mark added quickly, "This is her voice, clear evidence of disorientation, unfit to handle complex affairs. We urge the court to weigh this heavily." Mrs. Harding objected, but the judge allowed the recording to continue. My voice played again, distorted. "I don't know what I'm doing. I feel useless. I can't." Every syllable was mine, yet foreign. A mirror cracked, showing a face I barely knew. Around me, I felt the weight of the gallery's stares. To them, it sounded damning. To me, it was theft. Of my pain, my dignity, my truth. I gripped Richard's handkerchief in my lap, the fabric warm from my palm. My instinct was to cry out, to explain, to shout that grief and incompetence are not the same. But I held back. Silence once again was my shield. When the recording ended, the room was thick with unease. Ethan avoided my eyes, staring at the table. Clara, however, leaned back in her chair, satisfied. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Whitmore, do you wish to respond?" I lifted my gaze slowly, letting my voice emerge steady, unbroken. "Yes, Your Honor. That was my voice. But it was also my grief. A single moment carved out and made into a weapon. If we are judged not only by our worst hour, but by the twisting of that hour, then none of us could stand here unshaken." Murmurs rippled through the room. Clara's smile flickered, ever so slightly. Mrs. Harding then rose, firm as steel. "Your Honor, we will present evidence at the next hearing that demonstrates not only the manipulation of this recording, but also the context from which it was stolen. Grief is not incompetence. Widowhood is not madness." The gavel struck lightly to quiet the gallery. The judge nodded, noting the point. "Very well. We will hear that evidence." The hearing recessed for the day. Clara gathered her things with practiced calm, but her fingers tapped too quickly against the folder. She had expected me to crumble, to protest wildly. Instead, I smiled faintly, just enough for her to see. As I left the courtroom, the echo of my twisted voice lingered in my ears. It haunted me. But within the hurt, I found steel. They had turned my mourning into ammunition, yes. Yet by doing so, they revealed their desperation. Only liars need false echoes to win. Outside, the air smelled of rain. I tilted my face upward, letting the first drops fall. My voice had been stolen, distorted, but I knew the truth. The real story was still mine to tell. The rain started while we were still in the courthouse hallway, thin lines on the windows like veins. I stood beneath the fluorescent lights, hearing my distorted voice from the recording echo in my skull. For a moment, I doubted myself. If 1 hour of grief could be carved into a weapon, what remained of the woman I knew? Mrs. Harding rested a hand near my elbow, not quite touching. "Hold," she said softly. "Pain can be edited. Truth cannot." Her eyes were steady. "I have an audio analyst on call. We will challenge the file and demand the raw source." I nodded, but a hairline crack opened inside me. I felt it spread, a fracture from memory to faith. In the courtroom, Ethan stared at the table while my broken phrases filled the speakers. He did not stand. He did not say, "That is my mother in mourning." He said nothing at all. We walked toward the exit. Each step sounded too loud. I thought of the quilt in my lap, the handkerchief in my pocket. My hands were steady, yet my breath trembled. Grief is heavy. Betrayal is heavier. A bailiff passed with a stack of files. The papers smelled clean and indifferent, and for one dizzy second, I wanted to step back inside and testify to my own humanity. Outside, the rain met the cold and turned to needles. Mrs. Harding opened her umbrella. I refused mine and let the drops strike my face. They awakened the old accountant in me, the one who solved by staring straight through a problem. I said, "If they will twist my voice, we will answer with light." "Good," she replied. "I filed a preservation notice this morning. Phones, cloud backups. If they touched your words, they left fingerprints." In the car, the heater whispered. The city slid by, smudged and wet. For the first time since Richard died, I asked the ugliest question. What if Ethan wants me diminished more than he wants me safe? The thought scraped bone. I pressed the handkerchief to my lips and tasted detergent and years. Mothers are trained to forgive. We are not trained to forget. At her office, a young technician waited with a laptop. He spoke gently. "We see seams in the waveform. The sibilants repeat too cleanly. Natural speech has flaws. This file is polished where it should be messy." Colored lines pulsed across the screen. I did not need to master them. I could hear the lie. I could also hear my real breath beneath it. The night Grace held the phone while I cried. Mrs. Harding closed the laptop. "Tomorrow we move to exclude. Next week we bring our own recording." I looked up. "Our own?" "From Discovery," she said. "Not yours. His. There is a voicemail Ethan kept. The timestamp matches your long night. He told her he would deliver control once the papers were signed. We will play it. The court will hear agency, not care." The crack inside me paused. Not healed, but braced. I pictured Ethan with the phone at his mouth, eyes closed, bargaining with a ghost version of himself, the boy who never felt enough. I can pity that boy. I cannot excuse the man. On the drive home, the rain thinned. The house waited quiet. I boiled water, measured tea as if precision could steady the soul, and sat at the table where Clara once set her folder like a knife. I laid the handkerchief flat, smoothing the faded initials with my thumb. "You built us straight," I told Richard. "They will not bend me." The silence that answered felt clean. Before bed, I wrote a single line on an index card and taped it inside my wardrobe door, where only I would see it in the morning. Silence is not absence. It is alignment. Then I turned off the light and let the dark rest where it belonged, outside the borders I keep. The courtroom was hushed, as though it sensed what was about to unfold. Clara sat with her spine straight, Ethan fidgeting at her side, Mark with his folder open like a weapon ready to strike. I kept my hands folded over Richard's handkerchief, the fabric cool, steadying me. Mrs. Harding stood, calm as always. "Your Honor, before we proceed further, we request the court's attention to new evidence. Evidence that concerns not only the alleged incompetence of my client, but the integrity of this entire petition." Clara's eyes narrowed. The judge nodded. "Proceed." Harding gestured to the technician seated at the front. He placed a laptop on the table, connected to the courtroom speakers. On the screen, two waveforms appeared. One jagged, messy, alive with human imperfection. The other smoothed, manipulated, clipped. "This," Harding said, pointing to the second, "is the file submitted by the petitioners, and this," her finger slid to the first, "is the original recording, obtained through subpoena from a cloud backup." The sound filled the room. My voice again, but this time whole. "Grace, I just miss him so much. I can't keep track of days right now. Everything feels gone without Richard." A pause. The soft sound of Grace's reply. Then my voice again. steadier. But I'll manage. I always do. I just need time. The gallery shifted, whispers breaking out. Clara's mask slipped for a fraction of a second, her lips pressing tight. Harding's voice cut sharp. The petitioner stripped grief of its context, cut away comfort, left only despair. They presented a widow's sorrow as incompetence. That is not justice. That is deception. The judge's brow furrowed, his gaze landing heavily on Clara. Then Harding continued. Furthermore, Your Honor, we submit a voicemail left by Mr. Ethan Whitmore, dated the same week. It will speak for itself. Ethan's head jerked up. No, he whispered, but the recording had already begun. His voice filled the speakers, hurried, desperate. Once it's under my control, Clara says we can cover the debt. Pike won't wait much longer. Just let me get her to sign. She doesn't need to know. The silence after was devastating. Clara's hand shot to Ethan's arm, nails digging, but it was too late. The truth was out, undeniable. I sat very still, breathing slowly, my face serene. This was not revenge. It was revelation. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore, you will have opportunity to respond. But let the record show. This court takes such matters of falsified evidence with utmost seriousness. Ethan stammered, his words a blur of excuses. Clara's jaw tightened, her eyes darting toward me like daggers. But I did not look away. I let her see the quiet strength she had mistaken all along for weakness. Mrs. Harding closed her folder gently, as though sealing the matter. Your Honor, my client is neither confused nor incapable. She is targeted. And today, the mask has slipped. The judge nodded, striking his gavel lightly. We will reconvene after review of these files. Until then, the petition is under serious question. As the courtroom emptied, I rose slowly, gathering my quilt around my shoulders. Clara and Ethan remained seated, frozen in the collapse of their strategy. I did not speak to them. I only smiled, small and silent, as I passed. Because sometimes the sharpest strike is not noise or fury. It is the moment when truth, long buried, stands in daylight. The day after the hearing, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Even the clock in the hallway seemed reluctant to tick. I brewed my tea slowly, measuring each spoonful of leaves as if the ritual itself could steady my soul. Silence pressed around me, not heavy like grief, but sharp like glass. Clara had not called. Ethan had not come by. Their absence was its own message. For years, they filled my ears with persuasion, pressure, demands. Now nothing. And in that nothing, I heard everything. Silence, when chosen, is not emptiness. It is declaration. I sat in the living room with Richard's handkerchief folded neatly in my lap, the quilt wrapped around my shoulders. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the air was damp, the ground darkened. I watched the garden through the window, the roses bent low with water, yet still upright. They reminded me of myself, weathered but unbroken. For hours, I said nothing. Even when the phone rang once and stopped, even when an envelope slid under my door with no name, only a blank sheet inside, attempts to unsettle me, to provoke me. I left them unanswered. By evening, Ethan finally appeared. He did not knock. He opened the door like it was still his home. His face was drawn, eyes rimmed red. Mom, he began, his voice raw. Why are you doing this? We're family. I looked at him, steady, but gave no reply. My silence was louder than any reproach. He paced, ran his hands through his hair. Clara says you're just being stubborn, that you'll break eventually. But He stopped, swallowing hard. I can't stand this. This quiet. That was when I realized it. My silence was working. It had become a roar inside their heads, louder than my words could ever be. They thrived on my reaction, fed on my explanations, my defenses. Without them, they had nothing to hold on to. Finally, I spoke. Just once. Ethan, a fortress does not argue with the storm. It simply stands. He stared at me, speechless, his lips trembling. Then he left, slamming the door behind him. The echo rattled the walls, but could not touch me. Night fell. I lit a single lamp, its glow soft and golden. In that pool of light, I sat alone, yet not lonely, because I had discovered something essential. Silence, when anchored by truth, is not weakness. It is thunder waiting beneath the earth. Clara and Ethan mistook my stillness for surrender, but now they could feel it, pressing against them, chasing them in their sleep. Every word they twisted, every plot they spun, met not with chaos, but with quiet refusal. And quiet refusal can be terrifying. I closed my eyes and breathed deep. Richard once told me, "Zell, you don't need to shout to be heard. Some of the strongest words you'll ever say will be the ones you never speak." Tonight, I finally understood. The battle was not over. The court would continue. Clara would scheme. Ethan would falter. More storms would come. But they had already underestimated the one thing they could not manipulate: my silence. And so I smiled to myself in the dim light of my home. The world might hear nothing, but within these walls, my silence roared. I had avoided Richard's room since the funeral. It stood at the end of the hallway, the door closed, as though waiting for him to return. For weeks, I walked past it, my hand brushing the doorknob but never turning. That night, after Ethan's visit and the silence that followed, I finally opened it. The air inside was still, heavy with memory. His scent lingered faintly: soap, tobacco, and the cedar polish he used on his desk. The curtains were drawn, but a sliver of moonlight cut across the floorboards, painting the room in silver. I sat on the edge of his bed, the quilt still folded at the foot where I had left it. My fingers traced the grooves in the headboard, worn smooth by years of his hands. A sob rose in my throat, but I swallowed it. This was not a place for breaking. This was a place for remembering. On his dresser sat the fountain pen he had used for decades, its cap worn, the brass dulled. Beside it, a cracked leather journal. I opened it, the pages filled with his tight script, columns of numbers, notes from union meetings, and, between them, small reflections. One line caught my eye. Fairness is not always written in law, but in how we treat those who trust us. I closed my eyes, hearing his voice. That was Richard. Stern, uncompromising, yet tender in ways the world never saw. It reminded me why I fought, not just for money, not even just for myself, but for the legacy of a man who lived by his own quiet code. In the corner, his work boots stood neatly side by side, as though waiting for the morning. I bent down and touched them, the leather cracked, the soles worn thin. They carried him through mill floors, through strikes, through long nights coming home tired but never defeated. I whispered, "You built all of this, Richard, with sweat and faith. They will not dismantle it." A framed photograph rested on the nightstand. Richard holding Ethan as a boy, his arms steady, his smile wide. I stared at it, my chest tightening. How had we come here? How had the boy in that picture become the man willing to trade his mother's dignity for borrowed time? I set the photo down gently, refusing anger. Love and sorrow twined together, impossible to separate. Then I noticed the drawer, slightly ajar. Inside, tucked beneath old receipts, lay a sealed envelope addressed to me. My heart skipped. I opened it carefully. Zell, it began in his familiar hand. If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and you are carrying more than anyone should. You always carried us, even when we didn't notice. Promise me one thing. Don't let them take your stillness. It is your strength. Speak when you must, but never surrender the silence that is yours alone. Tears blurred the ink. He had known. Somehow he had known this day would come. I folded the letter, pressed it to my chest, then slid it under the quilt at the foot of the bed. His words would remain with me, as alive as any heartbeat. Standing, I looked around the room one last time. The pen, the boots, the journal, the letter. They were not relics. They were anchors. Proof that silence, when rooted in truth, becomes unshakable. As I closed the door behind me, I felt lighter. The battle was not finished, but I no longer walked into it alone. Richard's room had given me back my footing, and as I returned to my own bed, I whispered to the dark, "I will hold, Richard. I will hold." On Richard's old desk, beneath the lamp's golden circle, I laid out 2 envelopes. They looked the same, plain, cream-colored, sealed with care. But their contents carried different worlds. In the first, I placed a set of documents, proof of my competence, recent bank ledgers, letters written in my hand with clarity and precision, a notarized statement from Dr. Myers affirming my health. This envelope was truth, heavy, undeniable. In the second, I slid a set of forged drafts I had crafted from photocopies. They looked legitimate at first glance. Shaky handwriting, missing numbers, phrases that hinted at confusion. This envelope was bait. I sat back in the chair, breathing slowly. My fingers brushed over the paper, feeling the weight of choice. For weeks, Clara had treated me as though I were already diminished, already erased. Ethan had followed her lead, his silence cutting deeper than words. They believed control was theirs to seize. Tonight, I would let them reveal themselves. I thought of Richard's letter, tucked away in his room. Don't let them take your stillness. I smiled faintly. Stillness was not passivity. It was strategy. The clock ticked past midnight. My pen scratched across a small card, which I placed between the 2 envelopes. It read simply, "Trust is tested in silence." When the knock came, it was no surprise. Clara stood in the doorway, her posture sharp, Ethan lingering behind like a shadow. She carried her smile carefully, but her eyes betrayed eagerness. "We thought," she began smoothly, "that you might have reconsidered. After all, dragging this out only hurts you." I said nothing, only gestured to the desk where the envelopes lay side by side. Their eyes locked on them immediately. "What are these?" Ethan asked, his voice low, uncertain. "Answers," I replied softly. Clara stepped forward, her heels tapping like a metronome. She reached out, hesitated, then picked up the second envelope. The bait. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly as she slid a nail under the flap. Inside, the false pages waited. I watched her eyes flick across them, greed flashing, satisfaction blooming. She thought she had found what she needed, proof to bury me. Ethan leaned closer, his face pale. "Mom, what is this?" I did not answer. My silence was deliberate, my gaze steady. Clara closed the envelope quickly, tucking it into her bag. "This will help the court understand," she said, her voice honeyed. The real envelope remained on the desk, untouched. After they left, the room felt lighter. I sat again in the chair, my hands folded over Richard's handkerchief. The test had worked. They had chosen deception, eagerly, without pause. And in doing so, they had handed me more than any witness could. The next morning, I would walk into court with the first envelope. The truth. Clara would walk in with the second. The lie she thought was her victory. 2 envelopes, 2 choices, and 1 inevitable reckoning. I extinguished the lamp, the room falling into shadow. My heart beat steady. For the first time in weeks, I slept deeply, knowing silence had spoken louder than all their threats. The courtroom was colder that morning. Perhaps it was only me, carrying the weight of 2 envelopes in my bag. Clara and Ethan sat across the aisle, her posture unyielding, his eyes sunken. When the judge entered, the shuffle of papers and the creak of benches faded into silence. Mark spoke first, striding forward with confidence. "Your Honor, we present additional documentation, written samples that reflect Mrs. Whitmore's deteriorating condition. The handwriting is fragmented, the numbers inconsistent. This is clear, evidence of decline." He held up the envelope Clara had taken from my desk. I felt the breath of the gallery shift. They believed the show. Then Mrs. Harding rose. Calm, precise. "Your Honor, before the court weighs those documents, we present this envelope." She placed mine, the real one, on the clerk's desk. Authentic bank ledgers, correspondence, and medical statements, all recent, all notarized. The handwriting steady, the records exact. Not decline. Discipline. The judge examined both sets of papers. His brow furrowed. "They are clearly contradictory. How do you explain this?" Clara leaned forward, her voice velvet over steel. "It is obvious, Your Honor. My mother-in-law fabricated clarity in one set to cover confusion in the other. She is manipulative in her fear." Mrs. Harding shook her head. "Or perhaps someone else fabricated weakness, mistaking opportunity for evidence." The judge's gaze turned to Ethan. "Mr. Whitmore, these documents came through your household. Do you stand by their authenticity?" Ethan froze. His hands clenched on his knees. I watched him. My son, the boy Richard once lifted high in the air, the man now trembling in a suit that did not fit his spirit. Clara's eyes drilled into him, urging, "Say yes." Her whisper barely audible. But I said nothing. I simply watched. The silence stretched, longer and longer, until it became unbearable. Finally, Ethan stood, his voice breaking. I don't know anymore. I wanted to believe Clara. I wanted to believe this was the only way. But these..." He gestured toward the papers. "These aren't my mother's hands. Not the ones that balanced accounts for decades. Not the hands that held me steady when I failed." Clara stiffened, fury flashing behind her smile. Ethan's voice cracked, louder now. "I was wrong. I thought taking control would save me, but it only made me smaller. My mother isn't incompetent. She's stronger than both of us." The room erupted in whispers. Clara's mask shattered, her composure splintering as the judge raised his gavel for order. I did not cry. I did not reach for Ethan. I only bowed my head slightly, acknowledging his choice. It was not redemption. Not yet. But it was truth. And truth, spoken aloud, was enough for now. The judge cleared his throat. "This court will deliberate, but the petition is gravely compromised. The evidence presented by the petitioners is suspect, and Mr. Whitmore's testimony casts further doubt. Until final ruling, Mrs. Whitmore retains full authority over her estate and person. The gavel struck. Clara's shoulders slumped, her victory dissolving in the echo. Ethan sat down heavily, his head in his hands. I rose, gathering my quilt, my silence intact. I did not touch him, did not offer comfort. That was a bridge he would have to rebuild himself. But as I walked past, I whispered just loud enough for him to hear. Every child chooses who they are, Ethan. Today you chose. Do not waste it. The air outside was bright, cool, alive. The battle was nearly over, and for the first time, I felt the ground shift toward justice. The final day of the hearing arrived like the last page of a long, bruising chapter. The courtroom felt different, tighter, quieter, as though every soul inside knew something was about to end. I carried nothing but Richard's handkerchief and the quilt across my arm. No folders, no evidence. The truth was already standing. Clara sat rigid, her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes sharp enough to cut. Ethan looked hollow, as if a decade of weight had dropped onto his shoulders overnight. I could see the boy he once was flickering through, but the man beside Clara was worn, torn between shame and surrender. The judge entered, the gavel striking once. This court has reviewed the testimonies, documents, and recordings submitted. We have also considered the credibility of each party. Today, we render our decision. A hush fell. Even Clara's breath seemed to hold. The judge's voice was firm. The petition for conservatorship is denied. The evidence presented by the petitioners contained serious irregularities, including manipulated recordings and questionable documents. These actions not only undermine the petition, but suggest intent to deceive the court. Mrs. Zelda Whitmore retains full authority over her estate and person. The words hung in the air, steady as stone. Clara's face drained of color, though she fought to mask it. Ethan lowered his head into his hands. Mark shuffled his papers pointlessly, already defeated. I did not move at first. I let the silence do its work. It filled the room, larger than triumph, louder than anger. Then I rose, the quilt slipping softly against my arm. I bowed my head slightly to the judge, then turned. As I passed Ethan, I paused. He looked up, his eyes wet. For a moment, neither of us spoke. At last, I said gently, "The choice is still yours, Ethan. It always has been." Then I walked on. Clara did not meet my gaze. She was already retreating into herself, her plans collapsing like paper in the rain. Her silence this time was not strength. It was the silence of defeat. Outside the courthouse, the sun broke through a bank of clouds. People bustled past, indifferent to the trial that had consumed my days. I breathed deeply, the air cool, alive with promise. For the first time in months, my shoulders felt unburdened. Reporters called out questions, their cameras flashing. I did not answer. My silence was my answer. My stillness was my declaration. Back home, I placed Richard's handkerchief back in its drawer and spread the quilt across my bed. I traced its uneven stitches, each one a reminder of love, imperfect but enduring. I thought of everything lost, the trust of a son, the peace of my home, the quiet years I had hoped for. Yet I also thought of what remained, my dignity, my mind, my right to stand unbroken. The battle was over, but life was not. Tomorrow I would rise again, boil my tea, tend to the roses, perhaps call Grace for supper. Ordinary things. And yet, after all this, ordinary felt extraordinary. As I turned out the light, I whispered into the stillness, We held, Richard. We held. And the silence answered back, not empty this time, but full, full of strength, full of survival, full of a quiet justice that needed no applause. The house was quiet when I returned. Not courtroom quiet. Not the suffocating silence of accusation, but the natural hush of walls finally free from watching eyes. I stood in the doorway, my hand resting on the frame, and listened. For months this house had echoed, with voices not its own. Clara's smooth persuasion, Ethan's uneasy justifications, lawyers speaking in clipped, careful tones. Now, all of it was gone. Their absence hung heavy, but not painful. It was the kind of silence that comes after a storm, when the air smells of rain and broken branches, but the sky begins to clear. I walked slowly through each room, almost surprised by how empty they felt. The living room, where Clara once perched with her perfect posture, surveying every inch of my home like a hawk. The study, where Ethan had lingered awkwardly by the door, pretending he understood the weight of the papers on my desk. The kitchen table, once stacked with contracts and files, now lay bare, only a bowl of apples in the center. Their absence was louder than their presence had ever been. Yet not all absences were equal. Richard's absence still lived here, etched into every creak of the floorboards, every groove in the oak cabinets he built with his own hands. That was a presence I welcomed, because it reminded me of a love that had been real. Clara and Ethan's departure, by contrast, left no warmth behind, only a void that felt like fresh air rushing in. I sat in my favorite chair, the one by the window where the afternoon sun stretched across the rug. For the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to lean back and close my eyes. I wasn't afraid that someone would burst in with a document to sign, or that footsteps would creep down the hall with hidden agendas. I was alone, yes, but this solitude was not loneliness. It was sanctuary. The word vang mat echoed in my mind. Absence. Who is gone and who remains? Ethan had chosen his road, and I could no longer follow him down it. Clara had walked into the shadows she built for herself. Richard had left long ago, but somehow his presence lingered truer than either of them. And me? I was still here, present, whole. I reached for the quilt folded neatly at the end of the sofa and pulled it over my lap. Each stitch carried history, each patch a fragment of our lives. It was both a reminder of who was missing and a promise of what still endured. The handkerchief, tucked safely in my pocket, was warm against my fingers. Little anchors of memory in a sea of change. Outside, the maple tree swayed in the autumn wind, its branches bare but resilient. Seasons passed, people left, storms came and went, but the tree stood. Perhaps that was what I had become. Not untouched, not unscarred, but still standing, still rooted. I let the silence settle around me, not as an enemy, but as a friend. The ones who had tried to cage me with false concern and forged papers were gone. The people who truly mattered, Richard, Grace, even the girl I once was, remained here, stitched into the fabric of this place, into the rhythm of my breath. For the first time in years, I whispered into the empty room, "Thank you for leaving." The words surprised me, but they felt right. Some absences wound you. Others set you free. I opened my eyes and smiled softly at the sunlight spreading across the quilt. The house was no longer haunted. It was mine again. And in that quiet, in the presence of those who were gone and the strength of what endured, I felt not abandoned, but alive. The lake was still that morning, its surface smooth as glass, holding the reflection of a pale sky stretched wide. I walked down the familiar path, with the quilt folded over my arm and Richard's handkerchief in my pocket. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and the faint chill of autumn retreating into winter. Every step felt like the closing of a circle. I found the old bench by the water, worn smooth by years of weather and memory. Sitting there, I pulled the handkerchief out, its edges frayed, the embroidery slightly faded. How many times had Richard carried it to union meetings, wiping the sweat from his brow during long debates? How many times had I folded it carefully back into his drawer? Now it was mine alone. An anchor, a reminder, and, strangely, a companion. The lake reminded me of grief itself. It looked still, but beneath the surface are currents unseen, carrying both sorrow and strength. I let the silence rest between me and the water. For months, silence had been a weapon, a shield against those who sought to control me. Today, silence was different. It was soft, forgiving, almost tender. I thought of Ethan, my son, my only boy. His absence was a wound that would never fully close. Yet even in that pain, I saw the truth. His journey was his own, not mine to finish for him. Maybe one day he would return. Maybe not. My love for him had not vanished, but I had learned that love did not mean surrendering my dignity. Love without boundaries was not love at all. I thought of Clara, too, the girl whose childhood scars had turned into weapons against others. For her, revenge had been the only language she knew. I could not heal her, but I would not let her wound me any further. The handkerchief lay warm in my palm. I held it up to the light, watching how the threads caught the sun. Then I placed it gently on the quilt in my lap. Together, they told a story of battles fought quietly, of sacrifices invisible, of strength stitched into the smallest things. Not the pension, not the millions. This was the true inheritance Richard had left me: resilience, compassion, and the will to stand upright even when everything else crumbled. As the wind picked up, ripples spread across the lake, scattering the reflection of the sky. I breathed deeply and let the sound of the water steady me. I was no longer waiting for someone to rescue me or fearing the next blow. I was here, whole, present. I whispered into the air, not to Richard, not to Ethan, not even to Clara, but to myself. I am still standing. The words surprised me, but they felt right. They were not a declaration of war, nor a victory cry. They were simply the truth. I rose from the bench, folded the quilt once more, and tucked the handkerchief back into my pocket. As I turned toward the path home, I felt lighter. The past was stitched into me, yes, but it no longer chained me. It simply walked beside me, like a shadow softened by the morning sun. When I reached the edge of the path, I paused and looked back at the lake. Its surface was broken now by small waves, but it was still beautiful, imperfect, yet shining, just like life. And in that moment, I knew healing does not erase what was lost. It teaches you to carry it differently. So I walked on,